Welcome to another terrifying journey into the unknown. In tonight's video, we will dive into 3 spine-chilling true stories from America's darkest corners. From the depths of the dark web to a haunted house that has driven its inhabitants to madness, and finally, the restless spirits of Alcatraz Island. Each tale is a chilling reminder that some things are best left undiscovered. If you think you've seen it all, think again. Let's begin. Story name: The Dark Web Diary. It was a quiet Friday night, and Ethan sat in his dimly lit room, his computer screen casting an eerie glow over his face. His friends had dared him to explore the dark web, a place he'd only heard about in whispered conversations and horror stories. He was curious, but nervous, and as he typed in the special browser link that would lead him to the hidden depths of the internet, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was making a terrible mistake. The pages he stumbled upon were strange and unsettling. There were anonymous chat rooms, illegal marketplaces, and forums filled with bizarre discussions. But one page in particular caught his eye, a forum called The Dark Web Diary. The homepage had a simple message: "Do you dare to enter? The truth awaits." Ethan hesitated, but his curiosity got the best of him, and he clicked. The forum was filled with stories and confessions from users claiming to have had paranormal or supernatural experiences. Some stories were disturbing, detailing encounters with shadowy figures, ghostly whispers, and cursed items. But one post stood out from the rest. It was titled, "The Man with No Eyes." The post was written in red text, and it read, "To whoever reads this, once you see him, he will never leave. He watches you when you're alone, and he knows your darkest fears. Whatever you do, don't look for him." Ethan chuckled nervously. It was creepy, but he figured it was just another online urban legend meant to scare newcomers. He closed the post, deciding he'd had enough for the night. But as he was about to shut down his computer, a message popped up on his screen. It was from an unknown user with the handle Watcher101, and it read, "Hello, Ethan. Are you ready to meet him?" Chills ran down his spine. He hadn't used his real name anywhere on the dark web, and he hadn't told anyone he was doing this. How could this stranger possibly know his name? His heart pounded as he typed back a response. "Who are you?" There was a long pause, and then another message appeared. "I'm the one who watches. Look outside." Ethan's hands trembled as he glanced at his window. The street outside was empty, with only the faint glow of a streetlight illuminating the sidewalk. He took a deep breath, telling himself it was just someone playing a prank. But then his phone buzzed, and he looked down to see a text message from an unknown number. It was a photo of his house. The timestamp showed that it had been taken just seconds ago. Panic surged through him, and he immediately dialed his friend, Jake. "Dude, you're not going to believe this. Someone on the dark web knows my name, and they just sent me a picture of my house." Jake laughed nervously. "Man, you're probably just freaking yourself out. It's probably some troll messing with you." Ethan wanted to believe that, but something felt wrong. His gut told him this was no ordinary prank. Suddenly, another message popped up on his computer screen. "I see you've told your friend, but he won't believe you. No one ever does." Before Ethan could respond, his computer screen went black, and a faint humming sound filled the room. He tried to turn the monitor back on, but it wouldn't respond. He felt a cold chill sweep over him, and he realized that his room, which had been warm just moments before, was now freezing. Then, without warning, his phone buzzed again. This time it was a video file. With shaking hands, he opened it. The video showed the inside of his own room, recorded from the corner near the ceiling. It was a live feed, and he could see himself sitting in front of his computer, looking terrified, but he wasn't alone. In the corner of the room, a tall, dark figure stood, its face hidden in shadow. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He spun around, but the corner was empty. He looked back at the video, and the figure was gone. But the video kept playing, and the figure reappeared behind him, this time closer. In sheer terror, Ethan shut off his phone and ran out of his room. He bolted down the stairs and into the living room, desperately dialing 911. The operator's voice was calm, but Ethan's words came out in panicked gasps as he tried to explain what was happening. He glanced up at the living room window, and there, standing on the sidewalk across the street, was the same dark figure from the video. It had no eyes, only hollow, empty sockets that seemed to pull him in. The operator's voice faded as Ethan felt himself unable to look away. The figure slowly raised its hand and pointed directly at him. A sinister smile appeared on its face, and Ethan could almost hear it whispering his name. He blinked, and the figure was gone. The police arrived minutes later, but there was no trace of anyone outside his house. Ethan tried to explain, but they dismissed it as a prank or a hallucination brought on by stress. He knew better, though. He could feel the figure's presence, watching him from the shadows, waiting. That night, as he lay in bed, he heard a soft whisper in his ear. "You can't escape me, Ethan." For weeks, the nightmares continued. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the man with no eyes, creeping closer and closer. He tried deleting everything, getting rid of his computer, and even moving to a different town, but no matter where he went, the man with no eyes followed. Now, he lives in constant fear, knowing that he can never escape. Every time he looks into a mirror or glances over his shoulder, he expects to see that hollow, empty face staring back at him. And sometimes, just when he thinks he's finally safe, he'll hear that familiar whisper, "I'm watching you, Ethan." Second, a story name, The Haunting at Hillcrest House. It was a cold November evening when Jake and his friends decided to explore the infamous Hillcrest House. The old mansion was located just outside their town, hidden by overgrown trees and thick fog that always seemed to linger around the property. Local legends claimed it was haunted, with stories of strange noises, ghostly apparitions, and unexplained lights flickering in its windows at odd hours. Jake didn't believe in ghosts, but he couldn't resist the challenge of visiting Hillcrest after hearing countless stories throughout his childhood. They arrived just before midnight. The house looked even creepier than they had imagined, with broken windows, chipped paint, and a front door that hung slightly ajar as if inviting them in. As they stepped inside, a chilling silence filled the air. The only sound was their own footsteps echoing through the dark, empty halls. The walls were covered in faded wallpaper, and the air smelled musty, as if the house hadn't been touched in decades. Jake and his friends split up to explore different parts of the house, armed only with flashlights. The first few rooms were empty, filled with dust and debris. But then Jake heard a faint whisper coming from down the hall. He turned, thinking it was one of his friends, but there was no one there. The whisper grew louder, turning into soft, unintelligible murmurs that seemed to come from every direction. Jake felt a chill run down his spine, but he brushed it off, convincing himself it was just the wind. As he moved further into the house, Jake noticed the temperature dropping. It felt unnaturally cold, and his breath became visible in the flashlight's beam. Suddenly, he heard footsteps behind him. He turned quickly, but again, no one was there. He called out to his friends, but there was no response. The silence was deafening, broken only by the faint creaking of the old wooden floors. He continued down the hall, his curiosity getting the better of him. He entered a room at the end of the corridor, which looked like an old bedroom. In the center of the room was a single chair facing a dusty mirror on the wall. As Jake approached the mirror, he noticed something strange. His reflection looked slightly off, as if it were moving slower than he was. He leaned closer, staring into his own eye, when suddenly a shadowy figure appeared behind him in the reflection. Jake spun around, but the room was empty. His heart was pounding, and he felt a wave of fear wash over him. He knew he should leave, but something compelled him to stay. He looked back at the mirror, and this time, the figure was clearer. A woman with long, dark hair and hollow eyes, staring directly at him. She raised a finger to her lips, as if telling him to stay quiet. Panicked, Jake stumbled out of the room, running down the hall to find his friends. As he ran, he could hear faint laughter echoing through the house, followed by the sound of doors slamming shut one after another. It was as if the house itself was alive, trapping him inside. He finally found his friends in the main hallway, their faces pale with fear. They, too, had experienced strange occurrences. One had seen shadowy figures darting around corners, while another heard footsteps following him wherever he went. They decided it was time to leave, but when they reached the front door, it wouldn't budge. It was as if an invisible force was holding it shut. Panic set in as they tried every door and window, but nothing would open. The house was holding them captive. Suddenly, they heard a loud bang from upstairs, followed by a voice whispering, "Leave, if you can." They looked at each other, their fear turning to desperation. They knew they had to find another way out. They made their way up the grand staircase, hoping to find an exit on the upper floors. The second floor was even colder, and the air felt thick, making it hard to breathe. The lights from their flashlights flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. They entered what looked like an old library, filled with dusty books and cobwebs. In the center of the room was an old ornate rug, and beneath it they noticed a trap door. With no other options, they pulled back the rug and opened the trap door, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. The staircase seemed to go on forever, winding deep into the ground. They hesitated, but the sound of footsteps approaching from behind forced them to descend. The air grew colder and more oppressive with each step, and a sense of dread filled their hearts. At the bottom of the stairs, they found themselves in a small, dimly lit room with stone walls. In the center of the room stood an ancient-looking altar covered in strange symbols and surrounded by old, burned-out candles. The walls were lined with faded portraits of people they didn't recognize, each with hollow eyes that seemed to follow their every move. Suddenly, the door at the top of the staircase slammed shut, trapping them inside. They heard a faint whispering, growing louder and louder, filling the room with an overwhelming sense of dread. The shadows on the walls began to move, forming twisted, ghostly shapes that seemed to reach out toward them. In a final act of desperation, they huddled together, trying to ignore the whispers and shadows. Just when they thought all hope was lost, the door swung open and the whispers stopped. They didn't wait to question it. They ran up the stairs, through the hall, and out the front door, which was now wide open. As they reached the safety of the outside, they turned back to look at Hillcrest House one last time. In one of the windows, they saw the faint silhouette of the woman with hollow eyes watching them. She raised her hand as if to wave goodbye, and then disappeared into the darkness. Jake and his friends never spoke of that night again, but they knew one thing for sure. Hillcrest House was not just a haunted house. It was a place that trapped souls, and they were lucky to have escaped. Story title: The Haunting in the Shadows of Alcatraz. On a chilly October night, Ben, a history buff with a fascination for the paranormal, traveled to San Francisco with his friends Sarah and Luke. Their destination, Alcatraz Island, home to one of the world's most infamous prisons, known for housing some of the most dangerous criminals in American history. They had booked a night tour, hoping to experience the thrill of visiting one of the most haunted sites in America. Little did they know, their visit would be much more than just a thrill. It would be a night of terror that none of them would ever forget. The ferry ride to Alcatraz was eerily quiet, and a heavy fog blanketed the island. As they approached, the prison loomed like a dark shadow in the mist, its walls tall and ominous. The tour guide, a seasoned ranger, began recounting tales of prisoners who attempted to escape and those who never made it off the island. But what intrigued Ben most were the stories of paranormal sightings, faint whispers in the dead of night, cold spots that would send chills down the spine, and shadows that seemed to move on their own. Upon entering Cell Block D, also known as the Hole, they learned about the solitary confinement cells that were said to be the most haunted. Sarah nudged Ben, whispering, "You really think we'll see anything here?" Ben grinned, his eyes gleaming with excitement. "If any place is haunted, it's this one," he replied. As the group wandered through the dark hallways, something felt wrong. The temperature dropped drastically, and they could see their breath in the cold, damp air. Ben suddenly felt as though someone was watching him from the shadows. He brushed it off as nerves, convincing himself it was just his imagination. But then a faint voice seemed to whisper his name, almost too soft to hear, but chilling enough to make him stop dead in his tracks. "Did you hear that?" he whispered to Sarah and Luke. They shook their heads, but both looked uneasy. Luke laughed nervously, saying, "Come on, man, it's just an old prison. Ghosts aren't real," but Ben could see the fear in his friend's eyes. The group continued the tour, reaching the shower area, where many prisoners had met violent fates. As they stood there, Ben felt a sudden urge to turn around. When he did, he froze. Just beyond the group in the dimly lit hallway was a shadowy figure. It stood completely still, cloaked in darkness, its eyes hollow and empty. Ben blinked, and the figure was gone. His heart raced, but he decided not to say anything, fearing that his friends would think he was losing his mind. As the tour ended, the guide gave them a chance to explore on their own. Ben, Sarah, and Luke decided to venture down a corridor that led to the warden's quarters, which had long been abandoned. The atmosphere grew heavy, and an unexplainable dread settled over them. The three walked in silence, each step echoing through the empty halls. Then Sarah pointed to a doorway at the end of the corridor. "Let's check it out," she suggested, though her voice wavered with uncertainty. They entered the room, which was filled with decayed furniture and faded photographs of former wardens. As they looked around, Luke noticed an old journal lying on a dusty table. Curious, he picked it up and opened it, flipping through the yellowed pages. The entries were strange, detailing the experiences of a warden who had begun to see things. Shadowy figures, whispers in the dark, and a constant feeling of being watched. His last entry read, "The prisoner in cell 13 watches me every night. I don't know how, but he's always there. Even when I close my eyes, I see him. I can't escape." A cold shiver ran down Ben's spine. Cell 13 was notorious for housing an inmate known as the Shadow Man, a violent prisoner who was believed to have died under mysterious circumstances. Some said his spirit never left, forever wandering the halls, seeking revenge on anyone who dared to enter his domain. Suddenly, the door behind them slammed shut. The sound echoed through the room, and they all jumped. Luke tried to open it, but it was as if something was holding it shut from the other side. Panic set in as they banged on the door, shouting for help. The air grew colder, and the lights began to flicker, casting eerie shadows across the room. Then they heard it, a low, guttural whisper repeating one word: "Leave. Leave." The voice seemed to come from all around them, as if the walls themselves were speaking. Ben's heart raced, and he felt a crushing sense of dread. They were not alone. Out of the corner of his eye, Ben saw movement. He turned, and there it was, the same shadowy figure he had seen earlier, standing in the corner of the room, watching them. Its face was obscured, but its eyes, dark, hollow pits, seemed to bore into his soul. He couldn't move, paralyzed by fear as the figure slowly stepped closer. Sarah screamed, breaking the spell. They pounded on the door with all their strength, desperate to escape. Finally, as if some invisible force released it, the door swung open and they bolted down the corridor, not daring to look back. The tour guide found them, pale and shaken, and led them back to the ferry, where they sat in silence, too afraid to speak of what they had seen. As they left the island, Ben looked back at the prison one last time. He saw a figure standing at the edge of the island, watching them, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. A final whisper echoed in his mind: "You'll be back. I'll be waiting." The ferry pulled away, but the horror of Alcatraz followed them, haunting their dreams and filling them with an unshakable fear that they could never truly escape. Thank you for joining us on this journey through darkness and dread. These real-life encounters are a haunting reminder that sometimes the scariest things aren't the ones we see, but the ones we can't explain. What do you think? Are these stories real, or just figments of our imagination? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this journey into the unknown, be sure to like, share, and subscribe for more true horror stories. Stay safe, and remember, sometimes the darkness isn't as far away as you think.